Continuing on with Chapter 3, Sticky Notes, over here on page 61, we're continuing our discussion of specialists versus generalists. Our case study was about the Hawaiian Islands, and islands chains in general typically have more specialists because of limited resources. So they don't have a big variety of food or places to live, and so they specialize more that way. Makes them more valuable to more vulnerable to invasive species. So if a species that doesn't belong is introduced, they can outcompete for that food source, and then if they're specialists, it's very difficult for that species to adapt to a different food source. Going on to page 63. So your book does not talk about migration very much. So I added it to page 63 because on page 63 we talk a little bit about population distribution. And so some populations of species migrate. Short term, like every year, or long term, especially when you have changes in climate, the species may need to migrate to a different area for a longer period of time. So some do it to find food or water, like the wildebeest in Africa, they go to water sources, so they migrate for 1,000 miles to find water. A lot of, when they say birds fly north for the winter, they fly north for the summer, they fly south for the winter. Well, the northern latitudes have more food in the summer, but it gets too cold. So for the winter, they fly south where there's more food and warmer temperatures in the winter in the south. Like in our part of the world in Santa Clarita, we have a lot of migratory birds that come here during the winter because it's warmer, and we have things that grow. Our plants still grow in the winter, and so they can find food, and then they go north in the summer because the food here dries up because of the lack of water. And so they go north where it starts to warm up in the summer, and they can find food. The gray whale migrates to find food and to breed. So gray whales migrate up and down the California coast. They go to Mexico to breed and to give birth to their babies because the water there is warmer and safer for the babies. But there's not a lot of food there in the warmer waters, so then they travel north to Alaska in the summer. In the summer is huge amounts of food because it has almost 24 hours of daylight. And all that sunlight means tons of photosynthesis for plankton in the ocean, which then is eaten by other species and begins the food chain up there. Natural disasters, floods, fires, etc. can make animals migrate and move to find safety or shelter or food. And then climate change is going to really impact species. They're going to have to move to locations that's more in their preferred range of conditions. All right, going on to page 66. Over on 66, you need to know about the 3 types of survivorship curves. So type 1, what happens is humans are this type, that we have a high, people tend to live when they're young and die off when they're old. So we have young and old, so the population is high when we're young and then die off when we're old. And so we don't have very many children that die. Now, the opposite would be a type 3 survivorship curve. And what that means is that it's a species that has a ton of babies because most of them are eaten. So think of a frog lays lots of eggs which turn into tadpoles, but only, it might lay 1,000 eggs, maybe only 500 turn into tadpoles, and maybe only 2 turn into frogs. But once they get grown, they live a long time. Sea turtles are the same way. Sea turtles get eaten, but once it gets big enough, it will live for a long, long, long time. plants are all that way. Plants produce a ton of seeds, which is eaten, and then once the plant is grown and established and doesn't get eaten, it will live a long time. And so you can see that written here, and you need to know this for your exam. So populations will grow unlimited without anything that hinders their population. So when a population starts to grow, it will grow exponentially, and we call this a J curve, and it will grow unhindered and make lots and lots of babies, whether it's baby bacteria or baby doves in this particular picture. But what happens is that normally it's going to run out of resources at its carrying capacity. So this is a review from biology. Down here in this graph, we have limiting factors. So species tend to run out of food, water. They tend to attract predators when there's a lot of them. Diseases spread more easily when there's a lot of them. And these things stabilize the population at its carrying capacity. So you need to be able to recognize on a graph the location of a carrying capacity is when the population levels off. So this would be exponential growth, and then because of limiting factors, we have a carrying capacity. Make sure you know this here. This is a whole bunch of limiting factors. Make sure you know all of these. Sunlight, moisture, soil chemistry, disease, all of those things. When a population grows past its carrying capacity, it makes so many babies at once that there's not enough food, then they can all die, and this can cause a population crash. We'll see that on the next page. Going on to 68. Our limiting factors have two different types. We have density dependent and density independent factors. Density dependent are things that occur when there's too many of a species, like food runs out or diseases creep in. But then some things can knock out a population no matter what size the population is, and so that's density independent. So fire or a flood or some other natural disaster is density independent. It's really important to also understand that carrying capacities change. Down here, you need to make sure you study this chapter up into, this paragraph up into here. For example, when we had our drought in California, our carrying capacity lowered for most species of plants and animals. We could not support as many as we did before the drought. So that carrying capacity was lower at that time. And then the rains came, and then that carrying capacity rose back up to normal, or even higher than normal with a lot of rain. So when resources needed by population are abundant, this is still the same page, page 768, population growth usually accelerates. But when they decline, they become unequally distributed. So let's say in our drought, the water declines, but there was still water here and there, maybe people's ponds and backyards, etc. So it was unequally distributed. So resources declining lead to more deaths. And this should say births, not birds. So please change that to births. And it can lower the carrying capacity goes down. So higher deaths, lower births, lower carrying capacity. That's what those arrows mean. And up here at the top of this picture, know that exponential growth slows down over time and gives way to logistic growth. So make sure you read this figure and caption to help explain that process. All right, on page 69, know the characteristics of an R-selected and K-selected species. I should have this little arrow going down. My sticky note is a little bit strange here. You need to know the definition of biotic potential, and you need to know the characteristics of an R-selected and the characteristics of a K-selected species. So that makes a little more sense there. An R-selected species is usually a prey species. Usually most of the babies are eaten, bunnies and mice and rats and sea turtles, etc. And so they usually have a lot of babies because most of them are eaten. K-selected is the opposite. So make sure on this page you read through. I did not write most of the characteristics because I know you can read it and understand it. Make sure you understand that K-selected species are usually in stable environments and competition is high. And R-selected is usually the opposite of this. And it's important to know that most species are on somewhere in between. So a lot of species, let's say a sea otter, is probably somewhere in between here. Or a fox is a better example of something that's, a sea otter is mostly K-selected. But let's say a fox that has maybe like 8 babies a year. That's not quite K and it's not quite R. It's somewhere in between this. You also need to know that K-selected has a type 1 or 2 survivorship curve, and an R usually has a type 3 survivorship curve. All right, so now let's get to our little figures here. So we have some examples of some graphs. This is a beautiful example of just a great S-curve for limiting factors and carrying capacity. The next one here shows that this species, this mite, goes up and down, but if you draw a line of best fit, it would still level at its carrying capacity. This one here shows overshoot. So what happened here was that the predators were all taken away and the population spiked, but then there were so many of them, there was no food for any of them, and then they all died. So this one's an example of severe overshoot and a population crash. And then on page 70, the only thing you need to know is about ecotourism and some examples. Now, really this is an example of a solution to help preserve species. So the AP test will ask you to be able to write solutions, and this would be some solutions to preserving biodiversity in Hawaii. And so know some examples of ecotourism. And that's it for chapter 3.